Since most of the guests in the hotel spoke English, the owner put up a sign about the broken elevator. However, either he had a sense of humor or he did not have a good sense of the English language. Because the sign read like this: "The lift is being fixed for the next day. During that time, we regret that you will be unbearable." I've known some people that are unbearable, haven't you? Yeah. Sometimes I'm unbearable. Just ask Pam and my kids, I tell you. Yeah. Well, Lloyd said one day that he got a phone call from a friend that he hadn't heard from in a while, and an old friend called him and he says, I can't talk about my problem over the phone, but I need to see you. I've fallen into a terrible thing which I can't shake, can't get rid of. Well, Lloyd set the time to go to lunch with them, and they went to have lunch, and Lloyd was wondering, what is this terrible thing his friend could have fallen into, He just couldn't imagine. He used to be a staunch Christian, but he drifted away from the church, so he just couldn't imagine, what was going on. Well, he could imagine all kind of crazy things. Well, when they sat down for lunch, his friend blurted out what the problem was. He says, "Lloyd, I've become a cynic. I've become negative, critical, and a sarcastic man." Well, Lloyd was relieved that his friend had not done some heinous crime or killed anybody or anything like that, right? But it was clear he was distraught nonetheless for realizing that he was a cynic. And Lloyd says, my friend has been jarred into the reality of the kind of person that he had become. He'd been jarred into that because his wife had given him an ultimatum. She was not willing to spend the rest of her life with a man who had come to be down on life, down on people, and even down on God. Several friends had confronted him about his snarling attitude. 3 people had resigned from his company because they said they could not work in such a negative atmosphere. His attitudes had just poisoned the place. The man's world was falling apart, so he goes to his pastor, Lloyd, to get advice. That man, by his own admission, had become unbearable. Unbearable to the people around him. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you're on your way to becoming somebody like that. It happens, doesn't it? If so, today would be a good day to reverse your direction. Because today we're going to go up on a mountaintop. We're going to go on a mountaintop with Christ and his closest 3 disciples. You know the story well that we read in the scripture. Jesus is on a mountain with Peter and James and John. Suddenly Christ's face begins to shine like the sun, and his clothes become white as light. And at the same time, 2 of the most important figures in the Old Testament show up: Elijah and Moses. They appear and they're talking with Jesus, it seems like, and Peter and never at a loss of words, he says, "Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. This was an exciting time up on this mountain to see this Elijah and Moses and Jesus just glowing white." He said, "Let's build 3 shelters or tents or booths or dwellings," whatever translation you use here. "One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Let's stay for a while, right? Celebrate this moment." Well, while Peter is still speaking, he's excited, about what's going on. A bright cloud envelops them. And, you can imagine this misty mountain, right? This mist coming over them, blinding you where you can't see very well. And then there's a voice in the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." If a voice out of a cloud speaks to you, that sort of gets your attention, wouldn't it? Yeah. As you might expect, by this time, the 3 disciples were really terrified. They went from joy and excited to see Jesus sort of transformed up there, and Elijah and Moses, except this cloud and this strange voice And they fell down on the ground on their face. And in a moment, Jesus walks up to them, touches them, says, "Get up! Don't be afraid." And when they look up, the cloud is gone, and Moses, the image of Moses and Elijah are gone, and all they see is Jesus smiling at them. You know, this was the ultimate mountaintop experience. Jesus transfigured. That means his body took on that brightness and that glow. You know, something else was happening here. Moses and Elijah, their image, their ghost, or whatever it was, you know, Moses representing the law and Elijah representing the prophets in the Old Testament. And a voice from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." You know, if I was there, I probably would have gotten frightened too. You know, I believe, however, I would have had a transforming experience as well. I never would have been the same. We've had those kind of experiences in our life, those mountaintop experiences. Most of the time, we're on everyday, you know, humdrum time, you know, but every once in a while, we'll have one of those mountaintop experiences. This Sunday is called Transfiguration Sunday in the church calendar because it's the Sunday before Lent starts. It's just sort of a changing Sunday. It's a transfiguring Sunday. We're going from the green, ordinary growing time to Lent and a holy time, looking to the Passion. So we have this Transformation Sunday, this Transfiguration Sunday, to remind us that something is about to change. Something is about to change. Dr. William Stidger told of a story of a lovely 90-year-old lady named Mrs. Sampson. Mrs. Sampson was frail and feeble and even a little sick. But Dr. Steger said that when he was discouraged, he would always went to visit Mrs. Sampson. She had this radiant spirit, and it was contagious. And so one day he asked this 90-year young woman, "What is the secret of your power? What keeps you happy and contented and cheerful even when your body seems to be very frail and sick?" She answered him with a line from a poem. "I had an hour of glory on a windswept hill." In other words, she knew Jesus Christ. She had an experience that touched her, that moved her, that no matter what she went through, that was her anchor. 90 years old, sickly, feeble, but yet had that kind of joy and cheer. Listen again to her words. An hour of glory on a windswept hill. It sounds very much like Peter and James and John's experience on this Mount of Transfiguration. Sometimes we refer to special events in life as mountaintop experiences. Many of us have had those from time to time when God seems very close. It may have been on an actual mountain. It may have been by a seaside. I dare say maybe it even happened in worship. Such things have happened to people. Within the very walls of this church, people have been moved by God. I hope it can happen to you. Hope it happens to you today. Peter and James and John were with Jesus on a mountain when suddenly Jesus was transfigured and Moses and Elijah appeared with him and they heard God's voice speak to them. It was an awesome experience. Peter wanted to build 3 shelters, 3 places where they could just stay there and continue to live out that moment. And who wouldn't want to just stay at that event? I remember when I went to the Holy Lands about 25 years ago or so, and we went out on the Sea of Galilee and on a little boat, and one little lady said, "I think I'm going to stay." She threw her passport out in the water. Well, put it this way, her trip was over. She had to leave the tour and go get a new passport so she could make it home, right? But sometimes we overreact with our mountaintop experiences too, don't we? But we know sometimes we just want to stay. We want to keep that experience alive and going. But then there's other times when we don't want to change. We're comfortable where we are. You know that saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it, so why should we bother? Even when our attitude is not all that great, even when things aren't going great, sometimes we say, oh, we don't want to change. Some of us know we need to change. And the way we interact with others, the way we refuse to open up or do something differently. We enjoy being just the way we are. My dad was definitely like that. He wore his flat top that he got in the mid-50s when he went to A&M, and he wore that all the way through the rest of his life. He never would change it. Of course, when he was a teenager, I always made fun of him, right? But now I think about it, man, my hair is probably about the same style I had in college, too. Maybe less of it. Here over front. Less color. But some of us sometimes enjoy being grumpy and grouchy and hard to live with. Sometimes you wake up and you say, I just want to be a grump today. Sometimes you're like that. But sometimes we enjoy holding grudges or resentments, even when they're eating away at our very soul. We secretly like making others miserable sometimes, and even and sometimes especially those closest to us. Admit it. You don't have to raise your hand. Sometimes we get like that. We're human beings. Some of us are like Lucy in that old Charlie Brown cartoon strip. Lucy was pretty crabby most of the time. In this particular cartoon, Lucy says, boy, do I feel crabby. So Linus, her brother, decides she wants to make her feel better. He fixes her a sandwich. He gives her the sandwich and asks, now, is there anything else I can get you? Is there anything I haven't thought of? And Lucy replies, yes, there's one thing you haven't thought of. I don't want to feel better. Maybe you know someone like that. They've got a miserable attitude, and that's just the way they like it. Leave them alone, please. A woman named Linda Newcrumb was vacationing with a friend of hers in Canada. She was not having a good time. She struggled with the language barrier in the French areas. She couldn't make sense of the money. The weather was cold. She felt out of place. So Linda's friend, noticing her discomfort, suggested she look in her little travel book, her little travel guide, for some advice. And on one page of the travel guide, Linda's friend had actually underlined these words. She was preparing for this particular event. She underlined the words in the travel guide that said, when you travel, expect things to be different. If things are not to your liking, change your liking. I like those words. Change your liking. Those words reminded Linda that she was in control of her attitude, really. She could choose how she approached each new situation. Since that vacation many years ago, Linda has found those words to be a helpful guide in many situations. And anytime she needs an attitude adjustment, she reminds herself of that phrase, if things are not to your liking, change your liking. I think maybe Linda's onto something with that. Not everything in life is to our liking. Sometimes for our own peace of mind and for the sake of those around us, we must change our liking. But we do have the power to choose. I want to challenge you today to look at your life. Is there some area in which you need an attitude adjustment? Whether it's giving up a long-held resentment, or treating a spouse with more kindness, or whatever your need might be at this time. Peter wants to build 3 shelters and stay on that mountain and have that experience. And while he's still speaking, this bright cloud envelops him. This mist, this fog comes in over them, and a voice from the fog says, this is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples hear this, they fall face first to the ground, terrified. Jesus comes and touches them and says, get up, don't be afraid. It's amazing how often fear is mentioned in the Scriptures. And oftentimes it's really the opposite of faith, is fear, not doubt. Peter's out walking on the water on the Galilee, and he starts to sink. And Jesus says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" They're out in the boat in the Galilee. The storm comes up, and they wake up Jesus at the front of the boat. And Jesus just says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Oftentimes, fear seems to run the day. Jesus says, "Get up. Don't be afraid." Many bad attitudes can be explained by fear, because fear is one of the biggest obstacles we face. Listen, every healthy human being is afraid. That's why that's the way we were created. Fear is a self-preservation mechanism, built into the very fiber of our being, fight or flight, it helps us to survive. But yet we can't let it control us. Peter, James, and John felt fear as the mountain on which they stood suddenly became enveloped by this fog. They heard this voice come out of nowhere. They were terrified. They were afraid of the unknown. And Jesus said to them, as he often had to say to them, and maybe to us, "Don't be afraid." There's a story of a 7-year-old girl who was thrilled when her parents took her to Disney World for the first time, and she rode Space Mountain roller coaster. She rode it twice, and they loved every moment of it. Hey, Pam's even ridden Space Mountain. She was not real happy, but she rode it. Well, they loved Space Mountain. They loved Disney World. So this family went back the next year, and this time the girl's a little older, and they're standing in line, and she's now reading the warning sign. Reading the sign that the year before she couldn't read. And the warning signs said how fast this ride would go. "Dad," she said, "I don't think I want to go on this ride." He asked her why. Why would she be so nervous that when she'd enjoyed the ride so much last time? She replied, "Last year I couldn't read." A certain amount of fear is healthy. Some of us are missing some of the joy of living, however, because unhealthy fears are dominating us. We might sit shyly in the corner, afraid to interact. We might spend hours in needless worry. We fear what others may think about us. We fear aging. We fear death. We fear people who are different from us. The number of ways we fear can cripple us or numberless. Some of us are afraid to show that we are afraid. And the result can be, it turns inward. It can become anger, and then bitterness, sometimes prejudice and cynicism. And do you realize that the bad attitude that many people nurture is simply their way of coping with fear? How we need to hear the voice of Jesus say to us, "Don't be afraid." It could happen in this room today. It could happen to one of you. Listen to Christ's words. That's what the voice on the mountain says. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." And what is Christ's words? Do not be afraid. I hope you take worship seriously. Some of us come to this place simply out of every week out of sense of duty. You and I have the extreme privilege of taking our needs and our relationships, our fears, our attitudes, and laying them on the altar and giving them to God. Sometimes in the quietness of our own hearts, we can hear Christ speak to us. And from this, we can build a new attitude about life. Some of you might remember Gary Zola. Baseball season, it's starting up. I'm excited. They reported for spring training this week, and so baseball's my other religion, particularly the Astros, just to let y'all know. So when you see me wearing orange, I'm probably worshiping. Yeah, that's what it is. No, not really, but anyway, so here's a baseball story. Joe Garagiola was a catcher, and many of us know he was a great storyteller, as he was an announcer for years. He tells a story about the great baseball legend Stan Musial. Stan Musial, who was a tremendous hitter. Well, Stan Musial came to the plate in a critical game, and the opposing pitcher in the game was young and nervous because he knew Stan's reputation of and he knew who he was facing. Garagiola was the catcher. He called for a fastball to be pitched. The pitcher shook him off. He called for a curveball. The pitcher shook him off. He called for a changeup. The pitcher shook his head again. So finally, Garagiola goes out to the mound and says, well, I've called all three of your pitches, and you've called me off. Just what is it you want to do? What is it you want to throw? The pitcher's reply was, nothing. I just want to hold on to this ball as long as I can. Well, who can blame him? Stan Musial was a legendary hitter. And that's the way many of us are living. Holding on as long as we can to our grudges, holding on to our resentment, holding on to our fears. And why? Because we're afraid to let go. We're afraid we might have to change ourselves. Listen, Jesus is here today, and Jesus is saying to you and to me, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Listen to his voice. This day can mean the beginning of a new you. If you let go of that fear and resentment and whatever's holding you back, give it to Jesus. Let God give you the strength. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, we thank you for the time that we can come together and share our pains as well as our joys. Help us when we're afraid to support each other, to give each other strength, and to let us remember that we're never alone, but you are always with us, Lord. Help us to listen to you and not be afraid. In Jesus Christ's name.